and then we are going to have the opportunity later to review the topics. In this case, we are going to start reviewing the nature of reading. That is the last receptive skill that we are going to check. When we talk about the nature of reading, we need to start by making some assumptions about its nature. The first assumption is that we need to perceive and decode letters in order to read words. This assumption implies that a person who reads should be able to decode letters, the string of words, and for sure the sentences that compose a paragraph, and then a couple of paragraphs, and so on until you reach to be able to comprehend the whole message of a text. The second assumption is that we need to understand all the words in order to understand the meaning of a text. In practice, you know that it's not really necessary to understand every single word of a text. That's why we also apply some reading strategies. And some reading strategies are devoted to deduce the meaning of those words. Number three, the more symbols, in this case letters or words, there are in a text, the longer it will take to read it. It's not really true, this assumption. It will vary on how you as a reader have developed some reading skills. In this case, how fast you are able to process information you are decoding. So probably you may take an hour to read a text that has only 3 pages, and a student who have developed more reading skills, it will take only 10 minutes to read this 3 pages long text. So, in conclusion, we can say that those assumptions are not at all true because it will depend on readers' factors, previous knowledge of the topic, which is known as schemata, and of course, your interest in the topic of the reading passage. Additionally, when we talk about the nature of reading, we need to identify two perspectives. How you are going to process information of a text, and traditionally talking, there are two ways of understanding, assimilating the information of a text. The first one is bottom-up approach. In bottom-up processing, you as a reader will decode the words. And of course, you will be surrounded by a multiplicity of linguistic signals, letters, morphemes, syllables, um, other aspects such as phrases, grammatical cues, discourse marker, and of course, punctuation marks. From the bottom-up perspective, you as a reader will center your attention on trying to make sense to all those elements in the written text. The second perspective, which is known as top-down or conceptually driven processing, as a reader, you will try to infer meaning, decide what information you will explore in detail, what data you will retain, and which other information you want, how you are going to go further, go back. In this case, with the top-down approach, you will focus more on the use of reading strategies. In contrast, with bottom-up processing, we may try to follow in a linear way the reading passage from the beginning till the end. Nevertheless, we cannot say that one approach is better than other. In fact, what we are going to emphasize is the fact that both approaches, top down and bottom up, will be used synchronously. Why? Because at the same time you are reading a text, you are decoding words, symbols, you will look for discourse markers. And then you will also decide whether to pay more attention to one paragraph, then why you are going to skip the subsequent paragraph, or you will try to focus only on a first topic sentence for each paragraph. So that's why both approaches, bottom up and top down, works synchronously when you are processing the information and reading a text. So now, as I have mentioned at the beginning, we need to consider schemata and how schemata is activated. The reader brings his her own knowledge, their emotions, experience, and for sure, cultural knowledge. All those aspects are known as schemata to the printed word. So, for instance, when you are reading a text that is probably from literature, in order you can process, enjoy, and for sure to exploit the most of this text, you need to bring knowledge of the topic, historical context. Obviously, you need to be able to process the information by applying that previous knowledge you have to the written word. What does that mean? Imagine that I ask you to read a chapter of how to teach writing. In order you can retrieve the information, the first step is you will try to activate your previous knowledge of what's reading for you, how you have faced reading. Probably you will ask yourself, do I really need to read this chapter from the beginning till the end? Then you will question, what's the text task or what I have known as la tarea del texto. All that knowledge will constitute your schemata. That's why when you are reading, you bring to the written text two kind of schemata, content and formal schemata. When we talk about content schemata, we will focus on what we know about people, the world, culture, and the universe. when we talk about formal schemata, we are going to focus on knowledge about discourse structure. And in simple words, schemata that is divided into content and formal will work as a net since you will have previous knowledge of the topic and as well knowledge about the language and how it is structured to form sentences and then paragraphs. If I go back, when we start this talk, we review briefly some assumptions, some beliefs about processing reading. And some of those assumptions, especially assumption number two, talks about that we need to understand all the words. Nevertheless, we mentioned that is not really necessary. Why? As we have started discussing, we notice that in order to process the information of a text, of a written text, we need to know how to activate our content and formal schemata. And one way to activate our content and formal schemata consists in knowing ourselves how we process information from a reading passage. That's why in the second section, the role of affect and culture claims that reading is subject to variability within the affective domain. Why? Because if you like the topic of the reading passage, you won't notice, but probably you will finish sooner the reading. And oppositely, if you dislike the topic of the reading passage, you will take really long to finish that activity. And of course, probably if you focus on cultural aspects that are embedded in the written text, you will also be able to comprehend better the content of the text. In other words, if you are willing to read the text, you will need to be able to engage with the topic. And to be able to engage with the topic of the reading passage, you will also, if I say, feel something kind of enjoyment for reading about the topic. So far, any comment or question, something that you would like to express? All right, so I continue. Now, when we talk about the nature of language, we need to discuss the characteristics of a written language. And some of those characteristics are permanence, processing time, distance, orthography, complexity, kind of vocabulary, and formality. Let's explore each of those characteristics. Permanence. Remember that if we compare a spoken discourse, written language is permanent. And consequently, the reader has an opportunity to go back again and again if necessary, probably to a word, to a phrase, or a sentence. That's why sometimes you may say, I need to reread the text. Unfortunately, with the spoken discourse, especially when you are speaking, spoken discourse only happen once, and you cannot go back to take trace of the words that were spoken unless you tape record. Second characteristic, processing time. As you know, owing to your personal experience as a student, you know that most reading context allows you to read at your own rate. Nevertheless, if you are under an examination situation, you need to read faster. And it's not only reading faster per se, you need to apply some reading strategies. In this case, you need to take less time to process the written text. Opposite, if you are reading for pleasure, you may take long for reading and finishing the text. The third characteristic, distance. What do you understand by distance? When you are reading a text, you don't have at your disposal the author of the written text. In this case, you need to interpret the language that was written in some other place at some other time with only the written words as contextual clues. That's why you are far away from the writer of the text. The following characteristic is orthography. As you know, in writing we have graphemes, and those symbols stand alone as the one set of signals that the reader must perceive. In this case, when we are speaking, we have the phonemes, the sounds. In contrast, when you read, you have the graphemes. And the idea, or probably the reason why you are asked to rephrase a sentence or an idea when you are writing a text is with the purpose you have stated as clear as possible your thoughts on the written text. In this case, as you are not going to be on the side of the reader, you need to worry, if I say, to be able to express your ideas in an understandable manner. That's why, in this case, orthography is a really important aspect of a written text. That's why, if you have a neat orthography in the written text, the reader will be able to interpret and to read between the lines without any effort. The other aspect or the other characteristic is complexity. Wait a minute and I will explain that. When we talk about complexity, we need to perceive that the ideas are structured in the written text within more complex nets. What do I try to mean? Well, spoken language tends to have shorter clauses connected by more coordinate conjunctions. In contrast, writing has longer clauses and more subordination. That's exactly the kind of complexity that can be achieved in the written text. And as a second language reader, you need to retool your cognitive perception so that you can extract meaning from the written code. In other words, when you are reading a written passage, you need to develop some skills to identify which is the main clause and which is the subordinate clause, but in a really fast manner. Why? Because you are not going to examine the text as if you were a surgeon in order to take trace of the grammatical aspects. As a reader of a written text, the purpose for you is to identify the key concepts. In this case, those key concepts are commonly stated within simple clauses. And then some ideas are explained with more complex clauses, with subordinate clauses, for instance. Then the other characteristic is the kind of vocabulary you will find in a written text. The idea is that when writing a text, and obviously when you are reading the text, you will try to look for the most precise word so your ideas can be transmitted in the sense you thought at the beginning of your written part. What do I try to mean? The use of vocabulary in a reading passage should be specific according to the context, according to the topic, and for sure, according to the ideology that is embedded in the written text. Finally, the formality. Formality refers to prescribed forms that certain written messages must adhere to. We have rhetorical, organizational, formality in essay writing that demands a writer's conformity to conventions like topic sentences, the length of the paragraphs, and probably if we compare with literature or with poetry, we will have other kind of conventions. Formality in this case will refer to the kind of conventions according to the genre. In this case, if you are reading a academic text or if you are reading a literary text. So far, do you have any comment or question, please? Shall I continue? All right, so I will continue. Now, as I have previously mentioned, when we are reading a text, we need to apply some reading strategies for comprehending what we are reading. Some of those strategies include identifying the purpose of reading, use graphemic rules and patterns, use efficient silent reading techniques. Obviously, the classical skim the text, scan the text. Also, use semantic mapping or clustering, guessing, analyze vocabulary, literal and implied meaning, and capitalize on discourse markers. Let's review each of those strategies. When you identify the reading purpose, you will try to annotate the reason why you are reading the text. And of course, what's the purpose of reading implies what is the final product I will obtain by reading the text. Probably because I need to extract information, because of pleasure, probably because I need to practice for a English test. It will vary. Nevertheless, you need to be really conscious on the reason why you are reading the text. Otherwise, you will waste your time only reading without any result. The second the second strategy is to use graphemic rules and patterns. In this case, the idea of using one-to-one graphemic phoneme correspondence will be acquired only when you practice constantly reading aloud. Consider how you might provide hints and pointers of these patterns. For instance, short vowel sounds in patterns like bap, hem, lag, wesh. Long vowel sounds, for instance, the final silent E in patterns late, time, bite. Other patterns, long vowel sounds, for instance, sit, goat, distinguishing hard C and G from soft, in this case, cat versus city, rain versus gem. Something that you need to be conscious when you are reading aloud. And sometimes, although you are reading in silence, unconsciously you are sub-vocalizing. So, at the same time you are reading the text, you are sub-vocalizing, so you need to be aware of those graphemic rules and patterns. In this case, you will feel more relaxed when reading. And of course, your reading will be efficient. And also, the strategy of using different efficient silent reading techniques will imply to be just to recognize some rule of thumbs. For instance, you don't need to pronounce each word to yourself. So you need to make the effort, the conscious effort of just going from one side to the other of the line without subvocalizing. Also, you will try to visualize or perceive more than one word at a time. Preferably, you will try to focus on phrases. Unless a word is really, really crucial to global understanding, you will try to skip over it and try to infer its meaning from context. So you don't waste time looking up for the meaning of each word that you don't know. Probably you can take notes of words that you don't know, but don't lose time looking for each definition. Then the other strategy is to skim the text. Skimming consists of quickly running one's eyes across a whole text. Skimming gives readers the advantage of being able to predict the purpose of the reading passage, the main topic, the main message, and possibly some of the developing or supporting ideas. That's why you, as teachers, need to train your students to efficiently skim the text. And a complementary strategy is to scan the text. Scanning implies quickly searching for some particular piece of or pieces of information in a text. The purpose of scanning is to extract specific information without reading through the whole text. And for academic English, scanning, as you know it, is absolutely essential. Another strategy is the use of semantic mapping or clustering. This strategy consists in grouping ideas into meaningful clusters. So you can do it when you are highlighting the text and you will try to relate those phrases or words that you highlighted into one particular net. That is exactly how you are going to start developing your semantic mapping strategy. Probably this is something related to the strategy of annotating on the margin of the text. The other strategy is guessing. This is an extremely broad category. Learners can use guessing to their advantage, probably to guess the meaning of a word, a grammatical relationship, a discourse relationship, infer implied meaning, that is, reading between lines, also guessing about a cultural reference, and also guessing the content of a message. So, as you could see, guessing is a broad term and it can be used not only for guessing the unknown words. Now, the other strategy that will take time, in this case for the reading passage, is to analyze vocabulary. There are several techniques for analyzing a word. For instance, look for prefixes, look for suffixes that may indicate what part of speech it is. Look for roots that are familiar, the word roots. Looking for grammatical context and look at semantic context. Then the other strategy is try to deduce literal and distinguish from implied meaning. Implied meaning usually has to be derived from processing pragmatic information. In this case, how you could identify pragmatic information in a text? Well, this is evident in the use of these course markers. And here, when we are talking about these course markers, we need to remember the kind of relationships these course markers have. A clear comprehension of those markers can greatly enhance learners' reading efficiency. Remember those categories of discourse markers: enumerative, first, second, third; additive, again, then again; logical sequence, so, for instance, explicative; in other words, illustrative, as an example; contrastive, by contrast, contrast. So far, do you have any comment or question? Okay, thank you so much. So I will continue. Ah, sorry. Ah, okay. Thank you. Now we will try to explain and explore some principles for teaching reading. And which are those principles? They are not conclusive, but at least enumerative. First one, reading is not a passive skill. Second, students need to be engaged with what they are reading. Number three, reading should be encouraged to respond to the content. Sorry, students should be encouraged to respond to the content of a reading passage. Also, prediction is a major factor in reading. Number five, match the task to the topic. And finally, number six, exploit reading text completely. Let's review each of those pedagogical principles. As you know, reading is not a passive skill. To read successfully, we need to understand what the words mean, understand the arguments, and work out if we agree with those arguments or not. And for sure, trying to comprehend the context in which the written text was created. Second one, students need to be engaged with what they are reading. Obviously, you need to consider the topic of the reading passage so that your students are really engaged with the reading process. And as well, this will allow them to develop their reading skills. Principle number three, students should be encouraged to respond to the content of a reading text. Meaning, message of the text are as important as we are giving students a chance to respond to the message in some way. What does that mean? Ask questions about, for instance, do you agree with the writer's ideas? What do you think about its argument? Also, do you consider is relevant this text for your personal life? In what aspect is relevant for you? Do you consider that the author's ideas are current nowadays? This is how you can encourage your students to respond to the content of their reading text. Number four, prediction is a major factor in reading. Definitely, before you start reading, you need to enhance students' expectations. And for sure, Those expectations should be related to the topic of the reading passage. That's why, additionally, teachers should give students hints so that they can predict what's coming on. Principle number 5. Match the task to the topic. We need to choose good reading tasks after having chosen the type of reading. When we talk about reading tasks is, for instance, not only going with comprehension questions. Probably you can get students in trios, in groups of 4, and then they need to, for instance, look for a missing paragraph, or probably with the content of the reading text. You may ask students to participate in a debate, something that involves students not only passive skills such as answering comprehension questions. Probably you may include another activity in which they need to transfer the information to a diagram, and then later students will explain that diagram. Number 6, exploit reading text completely. In this case, you need to integrate the reading text into interesting class sequence, using the topic for discussion and further tasks, using the language for study and later activation. In this case, you will try to include a reading passage not only as an exclusive activity that is devoted for reading. You need to think that the reading passage will serve for vocabulary, grammar explanation, also for later productive activity in which students probably need to orally discuss about the content of the reading passage, or probably they need to write a brief comment on the main idea of the reading passage. That's how you can exploit reading text completely. Then, if we continue with other pedagogical principles, in this case, those principles are for designing interactive reading techniques. When we talk about interactive reading techniques, is how teachers can interact with the text and with students. In other words, the kind of reading activities that teachers implement should focus on these 7 aspects. The first one, don't overlook the importance of specific instruction in reading skills. Obviously, before you ask students to keep on reading for pleasure, you need to train students with silent reading activities that allow them to develop a sense of fluency. Otherwise, students may get frustrated because they don't process the information of the written text as they should. Also, silent reading becomes an excellent method for self instruction on the part of the learners. That's why you need to devote time, in this case, for silent reading. You need to train them, and this is the specific instruction in reading skills. Probably you need to train your students in how to annotate, how to highlight specific or relevant information, how to transfer information for a diagram, something like that. The second principle, use techniques that are intrinsically motivating. In this case, take as a primacy students' goals in learning to read English. For instance, students need to read to take a certification exam. So you will focus on developing reading strategies for a successful examination task. Otherwise, your students won't feel secure on how to tackle an examination reading task. Another way to enhance intrinsic motivation is to offer opportunities for learners to gauge their progress throughout periodic instructor initiated and self assessments. You may start giving every month, for instance, a quiz in which students need to check how effective they are developing their reading strategies. Probably you may focus only on identifying keywords of a short text. Probably another specific aspect is how students are reading between lines. And when students see their progress, their intrinsic motivation will grow. Balance, number three, balance authenticity and readability in choosing text. Authentic simple text can either be devised or located in the real world. For instance, news adverts, probably reports to essays, and another written text that can be taken from Instagram post. I don't know. Nevertheless, you won't only focus on the authenticity of the text. Sometimes daily life text contains words, structures that are not at your student's current language level. That's why you may try to make some adaptations. And in order to make those adaptations, you may follow Christian Nottal criteria. The first is suitability of content, material that students will find interesting, enjoyable, but at the same time challenging. Number two, exploitability, a text that facilitates the achievement of certain language and content goals that can be exploited for instructional tasks. And criteria number three, readability. A text with lexical and structural difficulty that will challenge students without overwhelming them. Then the other, number four, includes both bottom-up and top-down techniques. Remember at the beginning of my presentation that I tell you what is top-down and bottom-up. Top-down implies how readers infer meaning, decide what information to retain and what information should not be retained. This is how students start employing their knowledge, previous knowledge of the topic, previous knowledge of grammar structures, and all those aspects. And at the same time, bottom up processing. Bottom up processing implies how students identify cognates, false cognates, grammar structures, how students are able to identify complex sentences. That's why the principle number four says include both bottom up and top down techniques. Make sure that you give enough classroom time to focusing on the building blocks of written language. Number five, follow the S3QR sequence. And what is the S3QR sequence processing? Number one, survey. You will skim the text for an overview of main ideas. The first Q, question. The reader asks questions about what he or she wishes to get out of the text. In this case, you will train students to formulate expectancies of the information that they may find in the text. Then the other step is read. Read the text while looking for answers to the previous formulated questions. The second R, recite. In this case, you will reprocess the silent points of the text through oral or written language. You may write a short summary, you may answer comprehension questions, or you will answer your teacher questions orally. And finally, review. Assess the importance of what one has just read and incorporate it into long-term associations. Review implies that for the next class, you will ask students some questions related to the topic, probably specific vocabulary, something that you consider relevant. Principle number six, subdivide your techniques into pre-reading, during reading, and after reading. Before reading, you need to spend some time introducing the topic of the reading passage, encourage skimming, scanning, predicting, and activating schemata. While you read, there may be certain facts or rhetorical devices that students should take note while they are reading. Give students a sense of purpose for reading rather than just read because of it. Probably the purpose of reading, you will tell your students the information you are reading you will need for your debate or you will need for preparing a presentation. After you read, comprehension questions are just one form of activity. Also consider vocabulary study, identifying the author's purpose, discussion on author ideas, examining grammatical structures, or steering students towards a follow-up writing exercise, in which they may write a summary, they may write their thoughts about the topic, or probably they will do further research on the context in which the text can be applied. Then, number seven, build in some evaluative aspects to your techniques. Consider some of the following responses that indicate comprehension. For instance, doing. The reader responds physically to a command. Probably you may say raise your hand if the answer is yes, or raise your hand if the answer is not. Second, choosing. The reader selects from alternative post orally or in writing. This choosing implies that you as a teacher may have different options for your students to complement the reading passage. One option should be that you ask your students to discuss in pairs some guiding questions based on the topic of the reading passage. Alternatively, you may ask, depending on the topic at the language level, to make a drawing based on the topic of the reading, Also, another evaluative aspect is transferring. Transferring implies that the reader summarizes orally what was read. Also, you can use conversing. The reader engages in conversation that indicates appropriate processing of information, probably a discussion session on what was their thoughts about the reading passage. Then we will see now how to teach reading. First of all, we need to distinguish between extensive and intensive reading. When we are focusing on extensive reading, we need to remember that is really associated with reading for pleasure. And of course, that your students will have like a library at their disposal in which they can change and have more options for choosing the type of text they would like to read. So, when you have extensive reading material, you need to be cautious of the language level. Additionally, that the reading material has some comprehension questions, and of course, that this extensive reading material is available at students' disposal. The second form you can develop extensive reading is by setting up a library. You may ask if it is possible students' parents to donate some books so students start reading periodically. Probably you may ask students to read a book and give the summary of the first chapters in a week. So you need to make a calendar. The role of the teacher in extensive reading programs is not only a person who demands students to deliver homework, but also to create something known in Spanish como un café literario, in which students probably every 2 weeks or every month will exchange their thoughts and their impressions about the text they read. And probably the idea is that students invite their classmates to read the text they were reading. Then another kind of extensive reading tasks are to ask students to keep a reading diary in which they will express how they felt after reading the chapter, what difficulties they faced, how they surpassed those difficulties. Another kind of extensive reading task is that students may probably choose, they can vote on the most popular book in the library, and probably they may do some festivals, some reading festivals in which they are going to promote at school some books they consider are the most interesting books. Now, when we talk about intensive reading, it's the opposite. Instead of just reading for pleasure, you are going to force your students to read for a specific goal. In this case, you as a teacher will have some roles. First, as an organizer, you need to tell students exactly what the reading purpose is, give clear instructions, and set time to finish the activity. You may act as an observer. When you ask students to read on their own, you need to give space to do, and then you will only supervise that they are focusing on the reading task. You may act also as a feedback organizer. When your students start giving the answers to the comprehension questions, you immediately will be uh, you will be really aware if they are providing good answers or if they are misleading the topic. And then you will try to make your students conscious of how they can improve the reading process. Also, you may act as a prompter. When students have read a text, you can prompt them to notice language features, vocabulary aspect, grammar structures as well. Here, with intensive reading, you can also devote time for acquiring vocabulary. In this case, when you are in an intensive reading approach, you will only need to limit the amount of vocabulary students will review per lesson, per reading lesson. So in this case, how you are going to limit the amount of vocabulary. First of all, you need to give a time to the lesson for deducing words, probably for looking up for meaning of unknown words. You may say from 5 to 10 minutes of your lesson. Also, you will focus on students' recognition skills to identify words, phrases, and probably to identify how those words are related to a specific topic or probably to a specific subject. Then, when you are also enhancing your students' recognition skills, you will pay attention, closely attention to asking students to write like a vocabulary list, especially taking that vocabulary from the reading passage. And then you will have also to allow your students to bring to the class their own questions about unknown vocabulary. Also, you may ask students to create their own comprehension tasks. You can ask students to create from the reading passage like a contest game. And with those type of activities, intensive reading activities, you will achieve that your students focus on specific tasks that requires concentration, also mental agility, and for sure to have a sense of curiosity for deducing or taking note of unknown vocabulary. And then we are about to finish by showing types of reading activities. The first type of reading activity is answering comprehension questions, the classical one. Nevertheless, it has a disadvantage. especially with conventional text plus question. Why? Because there is no particular motive to read except just to complete the activity, deliver on time, and getting a grade. Reading tasks different from questions. A gap text. A gap text may be very useful for students to notice if, for instance, if there is a mistake in the information that is provided from one line to another, probably if there is a mistake in spelling of a word, another kind of gap text can be seen in the do-it-yourself question. You may ask students to create their own questions and then give the chance to pose those questions to their classmates. The other alternative is that students read a recipe. The idea is that students can match instruction with pictures or why not to act it out. At the same time, they are reading the recipe, they need to prepare the food and they have the opportunity to eat that food. Also, the other activity is that they read an extract from a play or film. The purpose of reading the extract from a play or film is that students will be able to better understand that fragment of the film, and why not, in the case of a play, that they can act it out. So, with this last part of the reading activities, we need to take a critical decision on how, as teachers, may start creating our activities or reading activities. In this case, the proposal is that you engage, first of all, on the topic of the reading passage. And then, before acting as a teacher, you need to embody the reader character. What do I mean? Before teaching students to read, you need to consider yourself as an experienced reader. So, in this case, you may model reading strategies. Secondly, you will need to demonstrate which are the most useful reading strategies that you have applied. Probably give like a brief explanation about the reasons why you consider the reading strategies you employ are the most useful. And for sure that there are other reading strategies that you will employ depending on the reading task you are facing. And finally, the idea of using reading strategies, you need to convince your students that is a long time that they need to devote for practicing and mastering the use of those reading strategies. And then that is the end. So I would like to listen if you have a comment, something that you consider interesting, or probably something that you know in advance about reading, the nature of reading, some principles or some techniques. You can tell me what you consider relevant either in English or in Spanish. Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, for me, one of the most interesting parts was schema theory, because I think it is very related to something we call that is knowing our students and their specific needs. And I feel that relates to the principles for teaching because we need to, as I already say, understand our students, their needs, their background knowledge, and the information that they already know. So we can give them material that will be engaging for them, and this will encourage them to actually use the material. Um, Knowing about their previous knowledge will also help us know what kind of material we should use. Another thing I really liked was about setting up a library, because I think it is really important to have students, to allow them to engage with content, sometimes in a more informal way, like not necessarily give them an activity or something, just allowing them to read something they like. Because it is through this input, let's say, that they can have a broader understanding. Sometimes they learn vocabulary, grammar, etc. And not it is not necessarily through instruction, rather just through absorbing that knowledge. And yeah, I think that is really important because it allows them for broader um, reception, and that will consequently allow them to be better at production, to have more tools.
Thank you so much for your insightful comments, Sarah. So, in general terms, remember that when we are reading, we need to consider, as I mentioned at the end of this presentation, that before a language teacher, you are a reader. And as a reader, you need to employ your own reading strategies and also activate your schemata. And by demonstration, you will also enhance your students into developing a reading task. I don't know if someone else have any other comment or a question about the nature of reading, about pedagogical principles for reading, something that have called your attention. Any one of you? Adelante, Fanny.
I think it is important to keep in mind that mm, a consider considerable number of students don't like to read. So, uh, since that point of view, it is important to to make relationships between the reading and another kind of activities. I mean, it's not just like reading in your mind, answer some questions. It is important to maybe um, find a most interesting way to teach students um, to read. For example, maybe with some stories or maybe with acting, make a performance, for example, and things like that.
Thank you so much, Fanny, for sharing this insightful comment. I really appreciate that you have also shared these impressions on reading.